6 months before Shuggie Bain was published, I was the Kirkus reviewer assigned to the book. And I just like loved it so much. And you know, this thing that you're seeing quoted all over the place, Shuggie Bain is a masterpiece. Okay, I said that. The writing completely transported me. I felt like I was in Glasgow in the period. I'm really interested myself in stories about addiction, and I felt like it was an incredibly human story, family story about addiction that showed how love is so powerful and so powerless at the same time in these situations. And that's something that's been a part of my life. And even though it was nothing like the situation of Shuggie and his mother in the book, the core of it was something that really resonated with me. So after I went and, you know, went crazy over this thing in Kirkus reviews and gave it a star and said it was a masterpiece and everything, I did not stop there. I pitched interviews for Douglas and have been, to me, it's a really, when you're a book reviewer, as I am, and you read, you know, 15 plus books a month, you don't find that many that you just really want to, you know, run to the mountaintops and make everybody read this book. And I have had that feeling so strongly about this book. And I think it's because of what I told you, because of my personal connection to the addiction issues, just like let it just come right into my heart. And also as a mother, as a mother and a daughter, I'd say the relationship between Shuggie and his mother hit really hard. And, I'm not, I'm not a raging alcoholic, nor was my mother a raging alcoholic, but the connection between Shuggie and his mother, the way that you can love someone so much, even though they're letting you down, I think that's something we can all relate to. And what happens in families. And then it's so cool when it's transplanted into a totally different culture, totally different period. You know, you're reading this book and you're like being educated on every page about, you know, things about Glasgow and the way life is and was in Scotland at that time that are something completely unfamiliar to you. And I find that another wonderful part of reading, you know, to learn and experience so effortlessly how things are, you know, were at another time in another place. Okay, so that was all totally incorrect for me to tell you that, so do not repeat it. And, but I just wanted to say. And I thought it would be good tonight to have Douglas open with a reading from the book to get us in the mood, to get us in the Shuggie mood. So I'm going to turn it over to Douglas.
Okay, well, let me read to you from the beginning of the book. This is actually the part of the book. It's chapter 2 where we first meet our heroine, Agnes. Agnes is the matriarch of the family. She is a beautiful working class mother. She styles herself on the Glaswegian Elizabeth Taylor. She goes to great pains to make sure her hair is always jet black and that her teeth are false and porcelain. And this is where we meet Agnes at the beginning of the book. Agnes Bain pushed her toes into the carpet and leaned out as far as she could into the night air. The damp wind kissed her neck and pushed down inside her dress. It felt like a stranger's hand, a sign of living, a reminder of life. With a flick, she watched her cigarette doubt fall, the glowing embers dancing 16 floors down onto the dark forecourt below. She wanted to show the city this claret velvet dress. She wanted to feel a little envy from strangers, to dance with men who held her proud and close. Mostly, she wanted to take a good drink, to live a little. With a stretch of her calves, she leaned her hip bone on the window frame and let go of the ballast of her toes. Her body tipped down with the amber city lights, and her cheeks flushed with blood. She reached her arms out to the lights, and for a brief moment she was flying, but no one noticed the flying woman. She thought about tilting further then, dared herself to do it. How easy it would be to kid herself that she was flying until it became only falling, and she broke herself on the concrete below. The high-rise flat she still shared with her mother and father pressed in against her. Everything in the room behind her felt so small, so low-ceilinged and stifling, so payday to mass day. It was a life bought on tick, with nothing that ever felt owned outright. To be 39 and have her husband and her 3 children all crammed together in her mammy's flat gave her a feeling of failure. Him, her man, who when he shared her bed now seemed to lie on the very edge, made her feel angry with the littered promises of better things. Agnes wanted to put her foot through it all, or to scrape it back like it was spoiled wallpaper, to get her nail under it and rip it all away. With a bored slouch, Agnes fell back into the stuffy room and felt the safety of her mammy's carpet below her feet again. The other women hadn't looked up. Peevishly, she scraped the needle across the record player. She clawed at her hairline and turned the volume up too loud. Come on, please, just the one wee dance. No yet, spat Nan Flanagan. She was feverish and arranging silver and copper coins into neat piles. I'm just about to pimp out the lot of you. Reenie Sweeney rolled her eyes and held her cards close. Oh, you've one filthy mind, she said. Well, don't say I didn't warn you. Nan bit the end off a slab of fried fish and sucked the grease from her lips. When I'm done taking all your menage money at these cards, you're going to have to go home and fuck that bag of soup bones you call a husband for more. No chance. Reenie made a lazy sign of the cross. I've been sitting on it since Lent and I've no intention of letting him get at it till next Christmas. She pushed a fat golden chip into her mouth. I once held off so long I got a new colour telly in the bedroom. Did I lose you all?
No, I don't know. So, Douglas, can you talk a little bit about, how I know that you didn't start life as a writer, and you came to writing this book not kind of late. And can you just sort of give us the story of Shuggie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the truth is I had always wanted to be a writer as a little boy, but growing up in Glasgow and growing up sort of in a really hard-working man's world in sort of poverty, I guess, books were always seen as sort of a very foreign thing, a little bit dangerous and a little bit feminine because they contained a lot of feelings and a lot of ideas. And so writing was just seen as something that wasn't for boys like me to do. Every man I knew was engaged in some kind of heavy industry, whether it was shipbuilding or steel, whether they were joiners or slaters. And so when I went to high school, to give you an indication of how hard times were, there was about 350 kids that started high school at 12 or 13. And by the time we concluded high school and were ready for university, there was only 13 children that were left. The needs of sort of the environment were far too pressing. At 15, they had to go and find work. They had to bring money home. And I don't fault them for that, but education just wasn't a priority in that way. And so when I was leaving school, I was actually encouraged. I wasn't discouraged from writing, but I was encouraged to go find a trade. And so I actually ended up in textiles, which then, funnily enough, even to my own surprise, took me into fashion. And then from there brought me to New York. And so when I started writing Shuggie, I actually started writing for myself about 10, 12 years ago, where I just really wrote in secret. I think I had such a chip on my shoulder being told it was not something that someone like me should do, that I sat down and I just wrote, and I didn't tell anyone. The only person I told was my husband. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell anyone else. And I just wrote because I had something to prove to myself. And it was only many years later, maybe about 5 or 6 years into the process, that I started to let people know this is what I was doing. And then from there, I mean, it's just been, when I allowed people to start reading my work, the reception has blown my mind and really humbled me. I'm so incredibly fortunate all the support it's received and to have a book published out in the world now, Marion, and your support especially. So thank you.
Wow. Well, talk about that. It must have been really unbelievable. And I was at the party on March 1st when the book was just going to go on sale. And, it's all so exciting and everything was so bright and great. And then by 10, 12 days later, it was clear that this thing was happening that was going to really change the way so talk about how the feeling about that.
Yeah, it's been disappointing and it's been weird. I think it's good to put it in the context of people who are losing their homes, their jobs, or their lives. And so for me, I've got to remember it's a book and I'll sort of recover from it. But it was amazing to have such a great reception at the beginning of February and then have the world really invert, where although some people have already discovered the book, every bookstore in the country is more or less closed. And so for a debut novelist to to sort of expect people to be able to see their book on a table, it's just that opportunity is gone. And so I can't lie and say that I'm not incredibly crushed and disappointed. I'm disappointed because I feel sort of like I've been working on it for 10 years. And so I almost could have had any other moment in 10 years that would have felt more fortuitous than this one. But when you carry something inside you for so long, you kind of want to get rid of it. You kind of want your writing to get out and to belong to other people. And part of what's been sort of cancelled and that's been really hard is just the opportunity to talk to readers like you and to meet people in Los Angeles and San Francisco and to discuss the work. I'm kind of ready to like sort of pass it into the world, and that feels like it's been sort of blocked.
Were you going to go on a book tour?
Yeah, I was going on a book tour, and so I think people are trying to pivot as quickly as they can to a virtual space, and this is amazing. But definitely, I was supposed to be at the Los Angeles Times Festival, at the Montclair Festival, and then one that was particularly heartbreaking for me is because as a Scottish American immigrant, I was so excited to go home. The book launches in the UK from Picador in August. And so I was so excited to go home and have my debut open at the Edinburgh Book Festival. And of course, that just can't be. It's too risky to have people congregate like that. And so that's just a little bit heartbreaking. But at the end of the day, I'm grateful to be healthy and to be well. And I'm hoping that the book will have a long life. Books do have a long life. And so, yeah. And so I'm excited for people to discover it. And I'm grateful for this.
Yeah, it's, I'm a writer too, and some of my books that are published in the early and mid 90s. So it's a long time ago. I actually have a book that was published in 1983, and Douglas was kind enough to read my book recently after I became such a fan of him. So this book was published in 1996, and they don't go away. They stay, and not just the book stays, but the characters stay, like now Agnes and Shuggie, really, they will live forever. And you could never know what's going to happen with a book either. Sometimes
I see a movie in this.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. I'm just butting in, but please, anybody who's wants to ask a question, either in chat or raise your hand. But I know that Marion wrote about this, but I'm just fascinated by, this is sort of autobiographical. I mean, or I know that you wanted to get into everybody else's head, which you do, but the basic storyline.
Yeah. So, I mean, I sort of, there was a reason why I didn't write a memoir, and that was because I wanted to create a work of fiction that told the point of view from many different people's perspective. I wanted really, as much as I could, to create this sort of, an epic's too grand of a word, but this sort of sweeping panoramic view of a city and of people who were struggling all together. And so I will confess that, I'm the gay son of a single mother who lost her own struggle with addiction. And so when I write scenes of addiction or alcoholism, I do write it from the inside. I write it from the perspective of, I understood how that felt to me, and so I project it onto Shuggie. But this is not the story of myself and my mother. But what it is the story of is, it is a sort of a collage of the people and the time that I grew up in. I mean, Glasgow is a beautiful city. It is a beautiful city. And like any city, it has many strata. It has people who are incredibly, cultured, educated, affluent. But as a sort of predominantly industrial city, it has a very big working class. And so when it went through all of the deindustrialization and the privatization of industry in the 70s and 80s, unemployment in the city actually went up to about 26%. Unemployment under Thatcher across the UK went to about 14%, but in Glasgow, because it was so concentrated in industry, it went to 26%, and it held there. So there was a lot of families getting by on welfare, on unemployment benefits, not just for a couple of months, but for generations. And so when you take that sort of poverty of hope, when you really give people a poverty of hope and they don't expect to go back to work, jobs don't come to town, then things like addiction and alcoholism and families start to disintegrate. It's just really all these things sort of sweep in. There's actually a medical term called the Glasgow effect, which says that a man living in Glasgow in poverty will die 12 years younger than the same man who lives a couple of streets away but has a job. And so it's
like being black in America.
Exactly. I mean, I think so in a lot of ways, but it's funny because for many years they couldn't quite discern what it is. Did you have to give them a job? Did you have to give them better healthcare? Did you have to make the houses better? And actually what it was just a lack of hope. They didn't see any sort of positivity in their future. And so when that happens, a lot of really bad things creep in, as we see happens to Agnes and a lot of characters in the book. But another reason why I didn't write a memoir is because I wanted to show that not only are the Bain family struggling, a lot of families were struggling in that time. I mean, even the sort of the rivals across the road, the McBennies, are still having an incredibly difficult time. I mean, it was really a thing that affected.
Oops, what happened?
That's okay. I'm here, I can see you.
Okay. Go back to it was an incredibly difficult time.
Oh, really? It was an incredibly difficult time for everybody in the city. And I think that's why I wanted, when I actually wrote the first draft of Shuggie Bain, because I was keeping it so private and to myself, the first draft was actually 900 pages, single spaced.
Wow.
I know. And so anybody that knows books, I mean, I know I can see some shocked faces, but anybody that knows books is publishers really want a manuscript that's about 350 pages, double spaced. And so my first draft was really, about 3 times that and so dense. And part of that was because I just wanted to get all of this out and really capture it on paper. And it was a good way to write because I didn't really get in the way of the story. I just let it flow out, and actually it came out in a non-chronological order. So I wrote chapter 13 first, and then I went to the other scenes, and I envisioned them all because I don't come from a traditional FA writing background. I saw them almost more filmic. My language is much more actually to do with visuals because that's how I'm trained. I have an art school background. And so I really saw these things sort of set up almost as a very filmic or a cinematic point of view. And so I allowed them to come out in that way. The problem is when you end up with a 900-page first draft, like my reader is my husband. I have an absolute saint for a husband. He is a great guy. I mean, the best guy on the planet. But when he's faced with 2 big binders of 900 pages, halfway through, he runs out of the ability to give meaningful feedback. And so he just started going through sections with a black marker and being like, no, and like, meh, and like, ugh. So these
good
things.
For him.
Good for him. Yeah. He's always been my harshest editor. And so, but that was kind of what it was. And so only in subsequent drafts, the book never changed, which is interesting from the first draft to the final draft. But what it did do is it distilled down. And so it narrowed and it sort of really got its focus. And one of the best pieces of advice that I received was actually from my editor. When my editor purchased the book, because I don't know if everybody knows, but you sort of shop a book around and then a publishing house says, oh, we want to publish this. He said to me, if you don't make a single edit, I will still publish this book. And at this point, it's 600 pages long. But through the editing process, what he really showed me to do, Marion, was to keep the lens on Agnes and Shuggie. And if I could keep the lens on them a little bit more, then their love became more powerful. Yeah. And so I was grateful for that.
So I know, skipping to, you're working on another book now. Are you writing in that isolation way still, or do you now show to readers in the process?
I still write in an isolated way. And I think another part of, no.
A lot of novelists do that. Some people really want to write the whole thing and before they show anybody. I mean, it's not like really weird to do that. There's sort of the world of writers is divided between people who need to read the pages to somebody every day and people who won't show anybody anything until they feel like it's cooked.
Totally. And to go further in that, if you think about the industry I just came from, fashion and design is such a community-based, collaborative thing. You can't achieve anything without someone making it, buying it, putting sort of orders against it, sending it overseas. And so writing for me is a much more precious space. And I enjoy the isolation of it. I never in my career, although my career has always been about creativity, I've never really gotten to create something just for myself other than my writing. And so I really protect that, Marion. And I think sometimes, my editor and my agent would like to see things, but actually I have to say I want to protect that
what are these things? I'm sure everybody would like to know what are the other things.
Well, I was really pleased to just be published in the New Yorker. My actual debut is not Shuggie Bain, but it was a short story that I wrote and was published in the January edition of the New Yorker. And now I'm working on my second novel, which is more of a love story between two boys. So Glasgow is again going to be set in Glasgow, but Glasgow has a really big sectarian divide because it's primarily a Protestant unionized workforce. It had a lot of Irish immigrant labour at the turn of the century that came in, and as immigrants often do, they were sort of placed in ghettos and they undercut working wages. And so for 100 years, there was an awful lot of tension. I myself, my mother's side of the family is Catholic, my father's side was Protestant. And so I really wanted to focus on this sort of love story, almost a Romeo and Juliet love story, which is divided along these sectarian lines. And so that's what I'm working on at the moment. I probably told you too much, but I'm excited. It's a much more different thing. It sort of took me away from addiction and really let me focus on how lonely it can be, how lonely it can feel to be gay in working class men's worlds.
One of the things that struck me about Shuggie, and it's something I haven't read too much, is, Shuggie is gender non-conforming from a really young age. Way before he could possibly have any sexuality, even as a toddler, people are already reacting to him as, no right, as it says in the book. And I don't think that experience of like the pre-sexuality experience of people, well, of course, not just gay, but all the different gender not conforming kind of thing, that is really conveyed, because it has nothing to do with him being gay. He's just a little baby, but how he walks, how he talks, and just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, like, just to sort of set the scene, I guess, is when you think about sort of working class communities in Glasgow, Scotland, that are sort of organized around housing estates or schemes, which in a lot of ways would be like what Americans might call projects, although they're not always necessarily so run down as American projects tend to be. But they're very sort of standardized communistic housing experiences where every single flat is the same and it's designed to be that way. And then if you think about the men who, because they're unionized and have very sort of level set wages, so you're very aware at all times that the family across the road from you makes the same amount of money as you, or if they don't, you know why. So there's that sort of conformity. And then the church and the chapel have such a pull in these small communities, certainly in the 70s and 80s. And so actually, I don't know if you can hear it in the background, but everyone's clapping for the healthcare workers in New York and banging their horns. It's really lovely. We were hanging out the window last night. It's really lovely. There's horns, there's everything. But so there's a conformity. So there's a really narrowness to how men and women are supposed to be and how they are, how they're allowed to be. Men they work hard, they drink very hard, they're quite distant, and women are meant to be respectable. They're meant to, they travel from belonging to their fathers to belonging to their husbands, and they're meant to raise a family and keep a clean house. And so when you start to get deviations from that, it stands out because it's really, really conspicuous. And so it's quite amazing. So Shuggie's actually, I had a journalist ask me today, Shuggie's really, really special. And I thought to myself, actually, he's not that special. He's just conspicuous. He's just stands out so much against what's really expected of all these kids and these other boys. I was talking to someone all the boys I grew up with seemed to forever be kicking something, whether it was a ball or each other, or then they would get drunk on a Saturday night when they got older and they would kick each other again. And Shuggie just isn't that boy, and so there is no space for him to exist. And I think the sad thing for Shuggie, or for boys like that, is he can't be at peace at home because he's sort of on the stormy seas of his mother's addiction, but then there's no peace for him, there's no safe harbor for him outside either. And so what you really sort of see is a character that just has nowhere to be himself.
And, I don't think it's that class specific. I mean, I think there's boys in Iowa who are from, middle class families in ranches or whatever, and that have the same experience. It's I don't know, now, finally, I guess there's more acceptance. There's finally now there's parents, you know, eagerly seeking advice about how to deal with their gender non-conforming child. But honestly, it's cross-class. Perhaps the expectations of boys in that situation are one thing, but they're you know, every situation has it, you know, and
totally. I think my point is that you're right. The Shuggie situation is across class and is international. But what I always felt about sort of growing up in like Glasgow was actually it was narrow for everybody. It was narrow for Agnes, for women. It was narrow for how men were supposed to act. Deborah Orr writes a beautiful book called Motherwell, which is essentially about her father that's a steel worker. And one day the girder sort of swings through the air and almost severs him in half. And he's a young man, he's maybe 24, 25. And after that experience of almost losing his life, he's too scared to go back into the steel mill, but there's no other work in town. And so her book is really about sort of how her father coped with that his entire life, just the fear that he didn't want to be in that. And so, but of course he couldn't express it. He couldn't tell other men. He couldn't say that's too dangerous, that's too scary. He had to do it. And when you grow up in like a coal mining community, as I did, there is that sort of narrowness and that sort of awareness. And so for me, Shuggie and Agnes, the reason why the community won't accept them is because they don't even go hugely against it. They're just not of it.
I just want to see, is anyone in the audience want to ask a question? Because we'd be happy to let you. Well, I have another question, if not. So I'm curious, who are your favorite Scott? You know, we in the United States, one of our biggest problems is that we don't get enough international books. There's it's so ridiculous how narrow the bar, how tight it is for getting books from other countries, and it seems like just a few come through. So I'd love to hear you talk about your favorite Scottish novelists.
Oh yeah, thank you. Actually, one of my most favorite Scottish novelists is an author called Agnes Owens. She's deceased now, but funnily enough, she was Billy Connolly's housekeeper. And so that's how she got her book published in the end. But she writes about sort of the same sort of milieu that I write about, but because she writes about it from a woman's perspective, there's such a tenderness and a beauty to it. And actually, it's very unviolent, although it still sort of deals with the same things, and it's just beautiful to read. And so one of her biggest books, my favorite, is called Gentlemen of the West. And she, I think, is one of the greatest Scottish authors that never received enough credit. I'm a huge fan of Alan Warner, who wrote Morven Caller, which was a really successful movie. I thought he's a phenomenal writer. Everyone knows Irvine Welsh, and Gail Honeyman, of course.
I'm curious, what's your feeling about Train Spotting? Like, did you like love it when it came out, or was it something you didn't? I don't know, what was it like?
Well, this might be too autobiographical, but when Train Spotting came out, I just lost my mother to addiction, and Train Spotting did a really weird thing where it made sort of heroin chic incredibly cool. And so I ended up at college with a lot of kids who were trying to sort of ape the behaviors of Sick Boy and Renton characters in the book, and who just thought, and they were middle-class kids and they had every opportunity in life, but they just were so taken with the trend of the book that they were sort of aping it. And for me, who had just lived it, I couldn't cope, actually, because it was so pervasive. It was such a cultural moment at the end of the 90s. And so actually, I only reread Train Spotting about 3 years ago, and only then, with some distance between myself, could I appreciate how phenomenal it is as a book. I mean, it's really a once-in-a-lifetime book. But at the time, I felt hounded by it.
Now I'm feeling so bad because
no.
But I brought it up in my Kirkus review. But the reason I brought it up in my Kirkus review is what I just told you. How many books have we read from Scotland? This book reminds me of the only other book I read from Scotland. But I hear you. It's a completely different kind. I mean, I can see that even though you can see it as a chic glamour representation, I mean, there's a deep, deep horror in that book that.
Oh,
yeah.
And actually, I think, to be fair to Irvine Welsh, I think the movie was more glamorous in a funny way than the book was, because actually when you read the book, and I know you will know a lot about this, there's a lot of sort of there's the onset of HIV, and there's other things that are sweeping the city of Edinburgh, and it's actually quite a horrific book. But for 18-year-olds in 1995, there was a lot of cool things about that book, and for me, it just intersected with my life at absolutely the wrong time.
Well, we think we can say that your book will not inspire anyone to start drinking.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
But I was talking actually to, I don't know if you know Garrett Conley, who wrote Boy Erased, which was just a movie. It was turned into, some people know it better as the movie with Nicole Kidman and Russell Crowe. But I was talking to him today, and you were saying my book won't inspire people to do that. But we were talking about the power of books that make you feel sad. Because a part of the criticism that could be levied against Shuggie is that it's a book that sort of grabs you and sort of hopefully breaks your heart. But what I was saying to Garrett today is, I think that's an important thing to have. There's so many things in our life that we digest and that we see that don't have any effect on us, whether it's an image or a magazine article or anything. And so when we commit to a book or to a piece of literature, for it to make us feel sad or to gut us, is a really powerful thing. And when I wrote Shuggie, I knew that I have a real conflict being from a working class background, Marion, but being a middle class man living in New York that has an okay life now. I feel like two separate people. And I think even my closest friends and family, a lot of them would admit they didn't know that I was two separate people, because I don't really talk about the poverty I come from. So when I was writing Shuggie, it was important for me not to package it for a middle class audience, there's a demand in publishing for a happy ending. I had editors meet with me who said, gee, I just wish Agnes would do this and like dust it. And the truth is actually not everybody gets to do that. Not everybody gets to pull themselves up and have a Reese Witherspoon movie at the end of their life. It's just not, not a Cheryl Strayed novel. It's, and so I had a big discussion today with Garrett about sort of the power of being able to journey into other people's lives authentically.
Right, and dealing with, but honestly, it's having a happy ending is not really a goal for a great book. I mean, it's very unusual actually for a book that really moves us to have a happy ending, because we know that because happy endings are, they're the stuff of fairy tales, and for all of, even in our own lives, even if we have relatively happy ending, we have so many, I think we're looking to literature to let us experience some of the feelings that we have in our real life this is reminding me of, not to talk about myself, but I have this book that's called the Big Book of the Dead. That's all these stories about dead people. And when it first came out and I was reading from it at different, book events, and people were always crying. And I felt so bad. And my daughter, who's only 18 years old, said to me, "Don't feel bad, Mom. People want to cry. They want to cry." And I think it's true. Like to have something outside your life come in and access all these emotions that you may have about your own life, but not, be shutting them down because you have to keep going on. That's one of the things that literature does for us.
Yeah, and we should be moved by art. I mean, at the end of the day, no matter how it moves us, it should have moved us if we're going to invest in it. I think it's good. Garrett was telling me the same thing. I wasn't to apologize for making people cry. He refuses to do it because he did the same thing.
I think a lot of people want to cry right now. I mean, actually, we had a virtual coffee hour, and almost everybody was like, I want to cry. I'd love, so. I have a question about, and I want to encourage everybody else to either raise your hand or write in the chat, but I have a question about how do you feel about Glasgow now? I mean, what's your...
That's a really good question. I love Glasgow. I feel homesick all the time. I've lived in New York for 20 years, Jeannie, and so I feel homesick all the time. My family...
Douglas, can you include, like I know that Glasgow used to be such a big, important city. Can you kind of give them that history?
Yeah, totally, absolutely. And so Glasgow, I mean, just to give you the real cliff notes of it, Glasgow is a city today of about 1.2 million people. It's the biggest city in Scotland. It is on the west coast of Scotland on the River Clyde. But at the turn of the 19th century, Glasgow had a concentration of about 2 million people living in about 2 square miles. They were all living in tenements and low-level houses, but it was because it attracted all this Irish immigration, all this labor from the Highlands, and just people were coming because there was so much work and so many jobs. It was an enormous port town. It imported tobacco and sugar from the West Indies and from the Americas, which actually still has ramifications on the poor health there today. But it's surrounded by coal mining mines, I mean, numerous. It made most of the ships for the world on the River Clyde. I think at its height, it had about 68 huge shipbuilding, whatever you call them, shipbuilders, along this actually quite a short river. There was steelworks, there was car manufacturing, there was railway manufacturing. It was just a place where all of these really heavy industry laborers congregated. And when times were great, that was great. And so even within my family's sort of personal history, you know, my grandmother and my grandfather would have identified as what Thomas Hardy called the honest poor, meaning they didn't have very much, but they went out every single day and they both worked and they made do on what they had. By the time the 70s and the 80s come along and industry is collapsing anyway, things are moving to China, things are moving overseas, textiles are moving to Italy, you know, then jobs are starting to collapse. Margaret Thatcher inherited an entire country whose biggest employer was the government, because everything was sort of public. It was all owned by the government, and then everything was also sort of paid for by the government. So the government was the largest bank in the country. So we were making cars, but they weren't affordable. They didn't compete with German cars or with Italian cars. Coal was too expensive. And so what she actually did, she just shut it all. She actually let it out for other people to buy it, so it wasn't government owned, and then it all folded and collapsed. And so within about 10 to 15 years, everybody lost their job. And the thing is the steel workers couldn't really turn to the shipbuilding because it didn't exist. They couldn't turn to coal mining, so people had nowhere to go. And so weird time is it sort of overlapped with a period in the city's history where these 2 million people living in tenements that might not have indoor toilets, that might be far too cramped and crowded, were then sort of rehoused in what these things in the 60s seemed like utopias. High-rise towers that didn't have amenities, but they seemed very healthful and very futuristic. Well, when you flash forward another 10 or 15 years, we know that high-rise towers become projects. And when people don't have jobs, these sort of housing schemes just become terrible places to be. And socioeconomic sort of limitations mean that people can't get off of them. So there's no amenities on them. The ones that I grew up on, there might be a shop, there might be a pub. There's certainly like a bookmaker's or like a place to bet. But that was really sort of it. There might be a playground, but there's nothing really, there's no library, there's no sort of healthcare services, there's nothing else. And people can't really get off of it. And so it all sort of converged to make a real crisis. If you ever want to see a photo, and I know there's might be some photographers in the crowd, but there's an amazing photographer called Raymond Depperdon who did these incredible photographic studies of Glasgow in the 70s. And the New York Times actually told him that they weren't going to run it because it was too depressing. And they're really stunning photographs.
And how do you spell his name? Depperdon? Or I'll look it up. Never mind.
Ardon. You have the first part second. Ardon. Deppard. A-R-D-O-N. But he gives you a really great sort of photojournalistic look at the city.
And another question I have is that I have the pleasure of listening to the audiobook, Douglas. Oh my gosh, the beauty of the language and it gives me chills. And I love Scotland anyway, but just listening to you talk now is just such a treat for me. So.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually, I get teased when I go home because my Glaswegian accent's got the corners come off of it. It's eased out a little bit, but it's funny, I can't listen to the audiobook because I think it's hard for an author to hear someone else read their work. But I've heard a lot of compliments, and I know I chose the narrator, and he's a really talented voice actor.
Okay, Tom and Mick, do you have a question, or do you know everything?
Yeah, I don't know anything, but let me say, I do have a question, a personal one for Douglas, is that been away for 20 years from back home, and when you do go back home, do you still see some of the old friends? And if so, what do you talk about at that point? if in fact you do see somebody, and you go back to the old neighborhood, and if so, what's the flavor of that these days? It sounds like everything's still pretty much depressed, but do you see any light at the end of the tunnel at this point?
Yeah. So actually, that's a great question, Tom. Actually, Glasgow's a reinvigorated, rejuvenated city. So I should have probably said that at the end of my thing. It's now a hub for banking and insurance and sort of telecommuting and things like that. And so actually, it's a really vibrant cultural city. So from when I was a kid to now, there's still a lot of people living in poverty, but really it's a super vibrant city. And it's actually a really big shopping hub. So people love to go listen to music and shop and these things. When I go home, I don't often go home to the neighborhoods because my parents aren't around. I don't go to the neighborhoods that I grew up in because I have no connection to them anymore. I'm cheered to see the people that I grew up around. I get the sense that everybody's doing better. There's jobs now. And so, one of the things that was really interesting about the 70s and 80s is when you come from a family of working men upon working men upon working men, then people assume that there's going to be a job for them. And so they follow their fathers into trades because they make a living and they're happy with what they're doing. And so when that gets disrupted, what happened in the 80s was there was just a lot of young boys, young kids, my generation, that didn't know what to do when they graduated school because there was nowhere to turn. An awful lot of them fell into drink and drugs, but an awful lot of them turned to education. And Scotland's an amazing country because it has free education for anyone that wants it. So university is free and accessible. And part of the reason why I'm sitting in front of you today is because I'm Scottish. I think actually if I'd been an American kid, I'm not sure I would have had access to that. And so I'm really grateful to a government that put me through essentially an Ivy League education, right? And so that's why I'm here before you. And so what I would say is everyone's doing much better. I don't necessarily have much connection with them because my family isn't, or most of my family's not with us, but I'm encouraged to see. One of the things that I am nervous about is I'm nervous to take a native story home. I think being away for 20 years, I'm encouraged because I think I have a perspective just by the sheer ability to step back and look at the thing. But it's always hard to take something back to people and be like, look, this is your story. And so I'm always a bit nervous about that. But early reviews from Scotland have been amazing. And so,
Oh, yay.
Yeah, so sorry, that was a long answer.
Great to hear.
Oh, that was a great answer. Thanks for explaining. Appreciate it.
Oh, Deborah Burns.
Deborah, yeah.
Hi. I'm not going to ask you a question, but I hope I have a word of comfort in these incredible times and this book that you've been working on for so many years to come out now. And I learned a lot. I had a book that came out 1 year ago today.
Oh.
And I have a media background, and for the life of me, I must be having too many cocktails in quarantine. Someone told me about your book last week, who we both know, and I cannot think of his name, but I will. But the point is, with a debut coming later on in life, after the big career and the life, you have a certain perception of what this book tour is going to be. And it's kind of like a wedding when you have the big one and you're in it and you say, what have I done? And it's over like that. I believe, I agree with Marion, I'm not through it all, but I believe that you've created something that will have a life of its own. And you're on this kind of magical carpet. You've done all the right things, and your book will sell. And this whole notion of the traditional tour, the bookstore, the gathering, yes, it's disappointing, especially the one in Europe where you were really looking forward to that. But more will manifest, and your book is going to soar. And the traditional approach of launching a book, as we know from our careers, when marketing is involved, that is so much more the end result that's going to contribute to the success of your book than dotting America at 10 different bookstores, where if even you're absorbing the cost for some of them, you couldn't sell enough books at that store to pay for the food that you ate on the plane.
Yeah.
So I just, you know, as a person who didn't know a year ago what I know now, I just hope that I can offer a tiny silver lining or sliver. You've created something fabulous, and it will soar on its own. Work on the marketing and work on getting people to buy it online, and you're going to be just
And
fine.
Deborah's a good marketer. That's
Oh, thank you, Deborah.
Well.
And what about, I know there are other questions. Brenda Briggs, I want to hear from you.
You're like teacher.
So I think everybody might feel the way that I feel in this time in our lives with this COVID and self-sheltering. I thought I would just be like reading like a maniac because I love to read. And I'm hearing from my friends we can't concentrate. However, I started this book Tuesday and I finished it so fast. I was so worried about him. I got up in the middle of the night to finish it.
Oh.
Brenda, that means so much to me. Thank you so much. I also cannot read right now, so I sympathize with that.
Yeah, but you captured it. I mean, I smelt it, I felt it, I heard everything. It's a book I will never forget.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I can't tell you how much that means to me. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Okay, anybody?
I really appreciate that.
Okay, anybody else have questions? We have Douglas has another reading for us, but I want to make sure that, I mean, there's just so many layers to this book and just so richly observed. I mean, just like she was saying, she smelled it and felt it and heard it. And I just have to say, as somebody who studied writing for my whole life, and to know that you wrote that and your background wasn't writing, I was like, oh my God, your phrases, your images, I'm just, you know what, I'm green with envy a lot. Some of them I'll stop and just go, oh, how did he think of that? Anyway, so I have to say that.
Can you guys call me every single day? Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love that. Now I could really use that right now. Thank you. I appreciate all of that. Thank you.
Yes. So raise your hand if you have a question, or otherwise we're going to have Douglas do another reading. Anybody else? Okay, then Douglas, it's you.
Okay, well, I'll leave you on the reading, but just before that, I just wanted to thank you for your time and your support. It's, I think as Deborah said and as Brenda said, it's, you know, I think we're all feeling a little bit isolated right now, and this has not necessarily gone to plan as I expected. So I'm incredibly grateful just to connect with you and see you, and it means a lot. The part I'm going to read to you now is actually from the heart of the book. It's really the point in the book where Shuggie realizes his mother, Agnes, who's been struggling with addiction, is starting to change. Something has happened inside her, something's shifting. He can't quite express it, but he can feel it. And this is the section about that. It's a little bit longer than the first part. Every weekday before the last bell, Shuggie's guts would tighten and he would raise his hand and ask most politely to be excused. Dull-faced Father Ewan would inwardly curse the little boy who seemed regular as clockwork. At first he would ask the boy to wait, just wait the extra 15 minutes till the school day was finished. Shuggie, always biddable, would nod with a wince and sit cocked slightly to the side, looking to be in genuine desperate need. His wincing and huffing would soon start to distract the other children, and the father would acquiesce. Later in the staff room, the soft-middled father would joke about what this miner's diet of boiled cabbage and ground mince might do for the clergy. The polite little boy, the only one who clearly knew the difference between may I and can I, had been getting the cramps at 3:15 almost every afternoon of the school year. Father Ewan had come to set his watch by it. So Shuggie would spend the last minutes of the school day sat on the low toilet. He would take his trousers down only to be safe, but he came to know it was only indigestion. It was the burning bile of anticipation, the rising fear of what might lie at home. Agnes had gotten sober many times before, but the cramps had never really completely gone away. To Shuggie, the stretches of sobriety were fleeting and unpredictable and not to be fully enjoyed. As with any good weather, there was always more rain on the other side. To have marked her sobriety in days was like watching a happy weekend bleed by. When you watched it, it was always too short, so he just stopped counting. The boy could not remember the change in himself. At what point the cramps died away and things became different was unclear. He could remember coming home from school one Friday in November and standing outside the house as he always did. Every small detail told of what lay within. This evening, the curtains were drawn tight against the cold and the lamps were on. His stomach lifted in hope. Shuggie opened the front door a crack, just enough so he could hear the hum of the house. He knew what to listen for. Wailing and crying foretold a bad night. She would want to hold him in her arms and tell him stories of the men who had broken her. If there was the sound of country guitars and melancholy singing, then the warm moistness of shit would start to wet his underpants. To hear his mother on the telephone was not always a bad sign. He had to creep in between the front door and the draft door to listen very closely to the tone of her voice, push his ear against the cold dimpled glass, and hold his breath. She didn't have to be crying or screaming or slurring her words for the drink to be in her. It could still be there. It often made her overly polite, a false Milgai accent full of long syllables. Her lips would pull away from her front teeth, and she would overuse words like certainly and unfortunately. These were the worst sounds to hear. Agnes was mourning her losses, but she was still too far from unconsciousness. She would sit him down and tell him her stories, only this time she would be angry and not sad. With a packet of half-smoked cigarettes beside her, she would glide her finger through the phone book and make him dial the telephone numbers that she read aloud. 554-6339. Holding the receiver in his hand, the boy would listen to the chirp chirp and hope that no one would answer. He grew ashen as a voice came on the other line. "Hello?" said the stranger. "Oh, hello. I'm terribly sorry to bother you." Agnes would nod her approval from the armchair. "I'm looking for someone called Mr. Cam McCallum." "Who?" asked the voice. "Cam McCallum," repeated the boy. "He lived in Denniston between 1967 and 1971. He was a bus conductor in the East End going between George Square and Shettleston. He had a sister named Renee who married a man named Jock." The voice, confused at this oddly detailed information, would say, "Sorry, son, there's no Cam McCallum who lives here." "I see. Thank you very much, sir. I'm sorry to have bothered you." Agnes would hiss with disgust from the front room and make him phone the next McCallum in the book. It was worse when they found who Agnes was looking for. The man on the other line would say, "Who is this? I'm Cam McCallum. What do you want?" The boy's heart would sink. "Oh, I see. Could you please just hold for a minute, Mr. McCallum? I'm transferring your call." Agnes's eyebrows raised incredulously. "Is that him?" The boy would cup his hand over the receiver and nod. He would hand the telephone to her like an obedient secretary, and Agnes would arrange herself as if Mr. McCallum could see her through the phone. "You bastard," she hissed as an introduction. "Hello, who is this?" "You dirty fucking whoremaster of a bastard." The man would hang up eventually. He always did. Agnes would take a long draw on her cigarette, then a long pull on the old tea mug. She would stab the redial button on the telephone and smile as it quickly reconnected her. "Don't you hang up on me. Don't you dare hang up on me. Who the fuck is this? Did you think you'd get away with it, eh? The things you did to that young lassie, you bad bastard. There's not a bleeding heart in you." Cam McCallum would hang up again, and if he were wise, he would wrench his telephone from the wall. Agnes slid her finger through the phone book like it was a menu, looking for something to fill her hunger. She moved on alphabetically to the very next man who'd wronged her. Brendan McGowan. "Now wait till I tell you about this scunner." She turned to Shuggie with the receiver crooked under her chin. Losing me was the biggest mistake he ever made. She could sit at the telephone table until it got dark. Then she could sit there in pitch blackness. The end of a lit cigarette was her only light. Shuggie sat next to the electric fire listening to her roar. He was afraid to switch on any lights, hoping the dark would make her sleepy, worried the light would draw her to him like a moth. With all this in mind, Shuggie crept home from school and listened carefully at the draft door, hoping that she would not be crying or listening to country music or sitting ready for battle at the telephone table. But even the hum of silence could set his guts twisting again. He had heard it once, and he had believed in it, the deafening hiss of nothing. He had crept into the house to listen closer, believing it was good news, and he had let his hands fall from his tight sides. Agnes was there on the floor, in her tight black skirt, in her good winter coat. She was kneeling like she was praying, but the backs of her hands were soft against the linoleum, her head fully in the big white council oven. The sound of nothing had been a trick. The hiss of silence was only the thick gas carrying it away. After that, he'd learned not to trust the quiet.
Oh my.
I hope everyone gets the cry they were desiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeannie, can I say something?
Definitely, I can hear you.
Jeannie, we can't hear you.
I can hear you, Brenda.
I can hear you too.
I didn't unmute myself.
So number one, Douglas, can you read the whole book to me, please? Please. And then when, you know, in my Southern accent, when I read S-H-U-G-G-Y, it's more like Shuggie, not Shuggie. Is that a common nickname in Scotland? What does it mean?
Yeah, I think because often, especially with Catholics and also the narrowness of sort of some of the families, you know, patriarchal names repeat a lot. So you get a lot of Jameses, a lot of, you know, Georges, you get a lot of Hughs. And so something that Scottish people do to just determine which one you're talking to is they give everyone a nickname. And so it makes no sense. But I guess in the same way that Chuck stands for Charles, Shug is the Scottish nickname for Hugh. And so, you know, Shug would be a man, and then Shuggie would be a little boy. And you're right, it's Shuggie, like hug, as opposed to shoe, like sugar.
Shuggie.
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 Love it. Well, is Sharon, Shannon, are you trying to ask a question?
No.
Oh, okay. I didn't know. I couldn't tell. Well, I just want to say thank you to all of you. And I know that the next one, Marion, what is the book for next month?
Bless you.
Bless you.
Yeah. Marion. Hey, Marion, can you hear me? You did it again. No, Marion.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yep, I hear you.
Okay, what's the book? What is the book that you're going to do for next time? It's the one you said you had one already picked out. Do you remember?
No, but I can definitely think of something.
No, you have something that you're already doing. You were already doing it.
Was it The Other Americans by Layla Lalami?
I think that's it. I'm sorry.
That's a really cool book that I think everyone would enjoy. Let me go back to the list and look it over and see what I think. I see. Because I was going to do the same one that we are doing in the Weekly Reader Book Club next week.
That's what he said.
All right. Well, I could find that out. Talk amongst yourself for 1 second.
I have one quick question, Douglas, and I don't know. I mean, it sounds like for your second book, you're back to Glasgow. Are you thinking to, at any point, include anything about the fashion industry?
I am actually.
Yes.
I am. I'm hoping to do that. Actually, the book. Yeah, I am. The weird story about that is I had sat down to write a book that I thought was squarely taking place in the New York fashion industry, and I started to write the bark story of the characters. And one of them comes from the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. You know, Harris Tweed, traditional like.
Oh yeah.
And I just I literally couldn't get off the island. So I think I will. I just think it keeps getting further and further away. I probably need a bit more discipline, but hopefully in the future.
All right. Well, just was curious, and I love that you just literally couldn't get off the island.
Yeah.
Couldn't get off the island. Yeah. I started writing about this man, and I couldn't leave him behind.
Well, I can't wait to read your first book, your debut novel, and congratulations. Thank you so much. And then I'll look forward to the second one as well.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
And Marion, it is the Other Americans.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting book about Arab Americans in the United States. So it's kind of a little bit of a mystery and it's everyone will really enjoy reading it, I'm sure, and love to talk about it. I don't know if I can get Layla Lalami to be here with us, but it'll be.
No, how great is this to have Douglas with us? This is just fabulous. So,
Well,
anyway,
thanks for having me.
want to
Thank
thank all of you, and this will be recorded, and I'll post it on our Facebook page after it does all its stuff. But thank you, Douglas.
And thanks, Marion, too.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you,
welcome.
Marion.
It's a pleasure. It's my
Thanks,
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Marion.
Bye.
Don't tell my
Bye.
Very much.